Welcome to another Lineside look at model railways. You know, one of the things I like most is to look at layouts and to talk about them. The layouts we'll be looking at will all have been at exhibitions and are, in my opinion, some of the finest anywhere. But you know, the problem at exhibitions is that you're such a long way away from your layout and you can really hardly ever see it properly. Whereas with the magic of our camera, you can shrink down right to the size the model maker would like you to be and be right in the layout, on the spot. Now, the layouts will all be to 4mm scale and most of them to British practice. But now, where was it? Ah, there it is, my passport. I should be needing that because we'll be going on a little continental diversion. It's pretty obvious when you go to exhibitions that railway modelers are developing new techniques and that the standards of layouts are getting higher and higher all the time. Now, Barry Norman is a very versatile modeler and his layout Petherick is very much admired. As with other layouts, realism is very much to the fore. But how many layouts completely follow prototypical practice or are totally accurate? Well, of course, in many cases, it's just not possible or practical. But is total accuracy an absolute necessity? As long as the layout creates a feeling of prototypical practice for a particular railway company and provides the atmosphere of an appropriate period of time, the model will be successful. Like a great many layouts, Petherick doesn't pretend to fully represent an exact location. What it does is to typify an area, in this case, the rolling countryside of North Cornwall. There never was a station at Petherick, and Barry's inspiration came from Little Petherick, which lies between Padstow and Wadebridge. It takes time to create a worthwhile model, not only in the hours of painstaking work, but in the research of the area, or in many cases several areas, picking up points of character that will eventually blend together nicely, creating little cameos. And what Barry has done is to take his points of character and to place them in very definite positions so that when the layout is viewed, the eye travels from point to point and finds something of interest at each stopping place. Much better than having all the attractions together in one spot. Barry has also been very careful about the relationship between trees, hedges, buildings, and lanes in the overall plan. Rather like a canvas artist, he's added and subtracted where he thinks fit in order to create a broad landscape of interest where the viewer is almost led without knowing it from one point to another with complete ease. And what a canvas it is, 15 feet long and 5 feet broad, built to a scale of 4mm to the foot and running on 18.2mm gauge track. The track plan and the station building are based on Otteram on the North Cornwall line. Other buildings are modelled on prototypes which existed along that line, now sadly closed. One of the things I really like about Petherick is the open spaciousness which Barry has managed to capture, beautifully conjured up by the gentle sweep of the fields in the background. You can almost smell the countryside. So now from the opposite end of the layout comes a through passenger train hauled by a Class T9 locomotive. Petherick is on a single line. A passing loop included in the station layout enables trains travelling in opposite directions to pass. The design of the layout is, as one would find at a typical country station, very simple, so that relatively few points and signals are required. In fact, only 5 points. And yet, the traffic movements are both interesting and enjoyable. Continuity of the train movements is achieved by having a fiddle yard at each end of the layout. From the operational side, only one simple control panel is needed. It was never Barry's intention for Petherick to be an exhibition layout, but exhibition managers are very persuasive. And after all, it's a compliment to be invited, and Barry himself has been well known on the exhibition circuit for a number of years for his painstaking work in reaching high standards of railway and landscape modelling. Earlier on, I talked about creating and placing little cameos as points of interest, and the very realistic grouping of these trees along the embankment is a good example. Keen observation of nature is a very valuable asset to a modeler in the portrayal of a realistic landscape setting. Very seldom does a modeler get things right to begin with, and Barry would be the first to agree. To my mind, there is a certain relationship which must exist between the railway and the surrounding countryside, and getting this balance right is the art of railway modelling. The railway is an integral part of the landscape, and not the landscape an afterthought to the railway, as so often happens. By trying out new techniques and new materials, studying and researching down to the tiniest detail, Barry achieves results which not only satisfy him, if indeed any serious modeler is ever satisfied with his work, but also delights his audience all over the country. Oh no, not another one. That's what you might hear when the Ashton in Midport is on exhibition. But Ken Ashbury, that is, won't mind me saying so at all, because this is Mark 6. And even as we were filming it, he was making plans for Mark 7. The first Ashton and Midport appeared on the exhibition scene in 1954. In this latest version, Ken has switched to 18.83mm gauge track. The layout itself is basically a circle of some 3 feet diameter, but all the normal facilities at a small country station are provided. The layout is based on a Great Western and London North Eastern joint line in the 1930s. It's totally imaginary, but if it did exist, it would link the joint line with the LNER line from Marylebone to Leicester across the Vale of Aylesbury. Showing what can be achieved in a small space, the layout measures only 7 foot 6 by 7 foot and breaks down into 6 sections. Each section is joined electrically by multi-pin plugs to the control board. The control board is a separate unit which hangs on the side of the baseboard and with only 6 connections to worry about can soon be operational. Pulling out of Midport is a local bound for Marylebone. The loco is an A5, one of many which operated suburban services in the Chilterns. Back on the control panel, Ken is setting up the road for a spell of shunting. These coal and cattle wagons are being placed by an LNER Class N5 loco into their appropriate sidings in the goods yard. What you hear in the background are point movements, but uncoupling is performed automatically by small magnets set between the sleepers. In this way, and together with automatic couplings, Ken can carry out all his shunting movements without leaving his position at the control panel. As I said earlier, this is Mark 6 of the Ashton and Midport, and it takes Ken on an average 2 years to build and complete a new version. Most of the locos and rolling stock are built from kits, but many of the buildings are scratch built. Coming into Midport now is a Great Western local from Prince's Risborough. Once the passengers have alighted, the locomotive, a pannier tank, runs round its train ready for departure. I like this corner of the layout, and I particularly like the canopies, which add enormously to the overall atmosphere of a Great Western station. Ken has put a lot of hard work and effort into his buildings and into the station details. And it's this which makes layouts like the Ashton and Midport so interesting for the exhibition visitor. The Great Western Railway often captures the imagination of modelers, particularly David Simonite's Coombe Melon. Once again, when that layout's on exhibition, it causes such a stir that it's impossible to get a good view through the masses. But watch what the camera can do. Coombe Melon, by any standards, is a big one. 33 feet long and 2 feet 6 inches wide. This is another layout built to 4mm scale and running on 18.83mm gauge track. It represents a busy single-line Great Western Railway junction in Somerset in a period of the late 1920s, and the station handles through and local passenger and goods services. At this end of the layout, we're looking at a local passenger train arriving from the Mendip Valley line, while a Great Western auto train pulls out of its siding past the water tower. These little auto trains were a familiar feature of Great Western branch line working, servicing the needs of communities in rural areas. Layouts which feature through station working will usually have a fiddle yard at either end, and a layout as long as Coombe Melon will need several operators to work the service. With a fiddle yard like this, it's no problem at all to realign the tracks and so turn the trains round to meet the requirements of a busy timetable. Coombe Melon is the result of several modelers, led by David Simonite, coming together into a group and combining their talents to develop a particular theme. It was decided from the start that the layout was to be up to exhibition standard and that it had to be operationally interesting. The track would be wired to allow multiple running and the scenery arranged to complement train movements. In this way, the viewer has something of interest to look at during periods when the trains are not actually passing. Little movements like this level crossing always add realism, and here the gates are put across the road which leads into the town. Now the local of the Mendip line gets the all clear to proceed on his way. These little pannier tanks were built in their hundreds and were one of the most useful and versatile locomotives ever to run on the Great Western Railway. There she goes over the level crossing, while the car and the steamroller wait patiently. A river runs at the edge of the town, and is crossed by a superbly modelled girder bridge. Obviously the tide's out at the moment because one or two small boats are high and dry on the mud. Further out in the country, the local farmer's herding his cows across the occupation bridge as the local continues onwards. In fact, onwards into the fiddle yard. Meanwhile, in the goods yard, we have another pannier tank collecting a brake van. As the pannier pulls away, the whole goods yard comes into view, and we can see in the background a well laid out yard bordered by a neat row of warehouses. Remembering that we are witnessing a scene from the 1920s, horse-drawn drays are very much in vogue. And of course, there's the familiar block of stables to accommodate the horses. In the old days, the horse was the prime means of local transportation. Where would we have been without them? Even for the sake of rhubarb. Now, changing into top gear, a fast passenger train thunders through the station. Down by the river once again, the boat builders are sorting out a ticklish problem. And still the tide hasn't come in. Not much hope for a fishing trip yet awhile. Nor of gardening, it seems, even though the sun is shining. The gardener is probably supping tea inside one of those old railway wagons. Now this I like. Corrugated roofing in true Great Western style. Very nice modelling. And indeed, so is this. Can you spot the join between the painted back scene and the fully modelled buildings? To me, this street scene is one of the highlights of the layout, and it's been beautifully executed. The models are all scratch-built, and each one is based on an actual building. It's not very often that at an exhibition you get a chance to see the layout from the operator's angle. But with the change in viewpoint, we can now appreciate the detail even more. Notice that the buildings are completely finished off all the way round. Even this coaling stage looks more interesting from this angle. The backs of the old railway wagons haven't been neglected either, and I think this attention to detail sums up the attitude of model makers to their hobby. Full dedication towards the achievement of accuracy, realism, and atmosphere. It's taken some time for the passengers to join the auto train in the bay, but now things seem to be on the move. Even so, it looks as if one or two of the passengers are going to be left behind. So, as the last train of the day rumbles over the girder bridge, the tide still hasn't come in. But then, of course, time moves quite slowly in these parts.
For me, it's a sheer delight not only to look at working trains and admire the scenery, but also to discover the amount of interesting movement that some models have been able to build into their layouts.
Wheel Louise falls into this category. Robert Tivendale has based his model on the tin mining industry of Cornwall. You'll find quite a number of wheels in the southwest, wheel being the Cornish for mine. Robert has packed an absolute wealth of movement into the 8 feet by 2 feet that the layout measures. Viewing from the front of the model, the main mine shaft is on the right, and it's here where the handling of the tin ore starts. The engine house and winding gear, which brings the ore to the surface, are based on the Mitchell shaft engine at Eastpool in Cornwall. Once the empty wagons have been filled from the hopper, they trundle off down to the treatment works, where the rock will be crushed and the fine ore extracted. The crushing plant is a mass of movement and noise, as you can hear. The noise is coming from the stamps, which do the actual crushing and mixing with water to form an ore slurry. Reminds me of an old-time fairground organ. From the stamps, the slurry flows to the rotary buddles, where the tin ore is separated from the waste material. The slurry can also be diverted to a set of ragging frames. They're just coming into the bottom of the picture now. And from there, lifted onto the water-driven bucket elevator to round frames where the finer particles of tin are separated. Once the tin has been bagged up, it's off on its journey to the coast for transshipment to the smelters in South Wales. One of the nice things about layouts like Wheel Louise is the combination of railway movements with industrial activity. I must say, one gets the feeling that something's happening all the time. Counterbalanced by large rocks, the wooden pump rod reaches down to a sump at the bottom of the shaft and so raises water drained from the underground workings. Momentarily, the train halts by the pumping engine before going off on another line to continue its journey to the coast. In fact, it's going through a hole in the background to end up in the storage siding until next required. Meanwhile, a now empty train leaves the crushing area and returns to the hoppers for another load. A supply train comes in from the storage sidings on its way to deliver beams and other materials to the works. Now just look at this lovely beam engine. Robert has gathered much of his information from old photographs, and undoubtedly these, and his obvious great interest in the subject, has produced a superb working model of great character.
Wheel Louise is a model where movement is used extensively to create interest, but it must not draw your attention from the superb details in the static scene.
Just look at this. The station master's garden at Petherick. And what a typical edge to the lawn. Just as it might have been in the years before the First World War, the period this model represents. A higgledy-piggledy array of flowers, shrubs, and probably weeds as well. And here in the vegetable garden, cabbages looking so real alongside the row of runner beans, all tucked away in that little triangular plot at the end of the garden. This standard of modelling relies on a keen sense of observation. In these programs, I've often talked about trees because, to me, they're usually modelled much too small. In proportion to the hedges and fences, these trees look about right, and indeed they look very realistic. And as we move in closer, we can see that the ivy is growing up and around the trunk and the branches. Very nice. It's a pity that figures can't be made to move, but if they're depicted in natural situations such as these two men chatting, they do at least look right. On the other hand, the careful positioning of figures can achieve a sense of movement. Notice here how the grass has been worn away by cattle entering the field. Again, detail like this shows a very keen observation of things around us. Such realism is not hard to achieve and makes a great difference to overall presentation, as Barry Norman will show us now.
I'm going to show you some of the techniques I used in building Petherick. Realistic, effective and very, very simple. I'm going to start by laying some of the very rough grass that you see along the side of all railway lines. To do that, I'm going to use some of this felt, which is used for insulating the bodies of cars. By cutting a strip off, it's going to be laid in a bed of glue along there like that. To start with, using a PVA glue, I'm going to put quite a thick layer. Plenty of glue so that it seeps right into the hairs of the felt like that. And then place the felt on top and press it well in before leaving it to dry. Now other grass areas like meadows, pastures need to be much finer, nowhere near as coarse as embankments. To do that I use lint, normal surgical lint like this. But first of all it will need to be dyed a green colour. Now it could be glued down like that, but the end effect is rather coarse. A much finer result is achieved by gluing it into a thin bed of glue and then ripping off the backing, just leaving all the very fine hairs over the surface. To do that I'm going to use the same PVA glue, but this time spread it out very, very thinly, putting the minimum amount of glue over the surface. So I just get a very fine covering, but it mustn't be thick at all, spreading and squashing it out like that. The lint can then be placed over the top, pressed down, but not pressed too hard, just smoothed out like that. Now that the glue is dried, I can start detailing these grass areas. Firstly, the lint. The backing can be gently pulled off like this, leaving the hairs stuck to the ground underneath. Some of the brown surface will show through, but this will give quite a nice effect to the grass. On the embankments, to get that clumped effect that's very common, it can be pinched off to pull off an awful lot of this thick, woolly felt. Keep pulling and pinching to try and get a nice, even texture. Now that all the felt has been teased off and the lint has been ripped away, I'm going to start colouring this area. The paint I'm using to paint the embankment is artist watercolour, mainly sap green, with a very slight amount of burnt sienna. To make it flow evenly through the rough hairs of the felt, I've added just one drip of washing up liquid. Moving on to the meadowland, the colour changes slightly, and I've put a little bit of dark hooker green with the sap green, just to make it a little more blue, and quite a bit more water, because it doesn't have to be as concentrated. Whilst the paint is drying, I'm going to build up a cornfield in this corner. I'm putting down quite a thick layer of PVA glue, and into it I'm going to put some small bundles of plumber's hemp. Plumber's hemp can be bought from a builder's merchant in a large skein, and each bundle is very carefully put into the glue like that. Small details like poppies can be added on the top once the whole field is dry. I'm going to continue filling up this area with little bundles of hemp, and when the whole corner is filled up, I should just put a thin wash of yellow on the surface of the field to make it perhaps a little more ready for harvest. Now that the lint has dried, I can raise those flattened hairs by using this nail brush, pushing it into the surface, rubbing it from side to side and lifting it. The same effect can be created on the felt by again pushing the brush in, moving it from side to side, lifting it to create that rough, uneven, coarse grass that's very common alongside a railway line. Now that we've created the basic texture on the grass areas, we can start adding details like the railway's lineside fence. Hedges can be put around the cornfield, and these are made from a normal kitchen scouring pad covered in flock powder. Hedging continues up the other side of the lane, leaving a small gap there for a gateway into the field. To create some of the detail that you'll find at the bottom of the hedge, long grass and weeds, I've cut a card template to fit there, and I'm going to spray some glue along the edge. Onto that I can then apply some flock, and when it's stuck I'll be able to blow off the excess. At the gateway to a field, the ground soon gets worn away by cattle, and on the model I've worn back the lint with this tool to create a similar effect. The gate, of course, can be placed in position, and some of the mud spilt out into the road beyond. To complete the scene, I'm going to add a tree. I'm going to start off with some soft iron wire like this, and once I've cut a number of these pieces, I bind them together into a group and then start forming the branches. By twisting it about, looking at a tree, I can get its structure. The branches are then covered in plaster to form the bark, and foliage is put on the ends just to complete its shape.
So there you are. Barry makes it look so easy, doesn't he? And it really isn't too hard, provided you follow a few simple rules and techniques. Take a little care, and don't get too anxious if things don't turn out right the first time. With a little practice, things will come right, and the sense of achievement and the amount of satisfaction you'll get when it's finished will be enormous.
Well, we're now coming to our slight diversion. We're going to the continent, to Switzerland to be precise, to visit the Rätische Bahn.
The Rätische Bahn, the Rhaetian Railways, is a meter gauge line, and Barry Kelsel's model is a close interpretation of the real thing. Barry decided on a section of the Albula line between Chur and St. Moritz. It is here that there is sufficiently heavy traffic to make the layout very interesting. From the right-hand side of the layout, this crocodile locomotive pulls a mixed passenger and freight train in from St. Moritz and is due here at Filisur at 0928. The centerpiece of the layout is Filisur station, and as the train pulls in past the Hotel Grishuna, we begin to see tracks leading into the station area. The station buildings are just coming into view now. Railways in Switzerland are normally electrified, and current is drawn from overhead wires. Barry operates the layout to a very strict timetable, and the crocodile is now due to shunt some of its wagons into the goods sidings. The wagons are uncoupled using small electric motors which operate lifting ramps between the rails. Now it's nearly 0940. From the left of the layout, a local passenger train from Davos emerges from the cutting and descends the gentle gradient into Filisur station. The traffic over the main line through Filisur is heavy. It's the only rail route into the Engadine Valley and onwards over the Bernina Pass into Italy. Filisur is one of the few stations with loops long enough to allow the crossing of heavy trains. Again, from St. Moritz comes a long cement train, due in at 0948. Another thing I enjoy about Barry Kelsel's layout is that from any viewpoint, the scene matches up with the real thing. If you know the area, as I do, you'll perhaps notice a discrepancy here or there, but overall it's a delightful model of this part of Switzerland. Now we've moved to the left of the layout to see the Bernina Express from Chur. Just listen to that realistic clickety-click over the railroads. The Chur line climbs steadily up the 1 in 30 gradient into Filisur, which provides the junction for the single line branch to Davos, leading out on the left. This is a particularly attractive viewpoint through the avenue of trees as the express approaches the station to arrive at 09:54 precisely. Meanwhile, another express, the Glaciers Express from St. Moritz, is approaching. This is due in at 09:55, and therefore the Bernina will have to wait in the station for its arrival before it can continue. These express trains are quite long, and as I said earlier, Filisur is one of the few stations on this line which can accommodate several long trains at one time. The system of bells you hear is typical of the Swiss railway scene, and it's used as a warning of the departure of trains. In this case, it's for the Bernina, continuing its journey. The station area, of course, is on level ground, with the St. Moritz line climbing steadily into the tunnel mouth and through the mountains. More bells, this time to signal the departure of the Glacier Express at 09:57, bound for Chur. Here she comes, down the gradient from the station and off into the countryside beyond. As some of you will know, my own origins are from the continent, and a scene like this brings back pleasant memories. Just time before the next scene for a quick yodel. YOLO! Ah, better not. Back in the station area, the locomotive of the Davos service runs round its train in readiness for the return trip. The pantographs on the locomotives and the overhead lines certainly adds to the atmosphere of a continental layout. A look at my watch, and yes, it's nearly 10:14, the time the railcar from Chur is due to arrive. Completing its run round, ready for departure at 10:18, is the Davos local. Right behind it, the Chur railcar arrives. And that's a very smooth approach, Barry, and a perfect stop. The control panel is one of two which are used to operate the whole system. Now just look at the delicate shades of green in the landscape, contrasting with the bright red of the locomotive. A truly delightful piece of Swiss railway modelling. Having waited in the station for 30 minutes, the cement train now trundles off to Chur. Around 1,000 trees and bushes have been used on the layout, and I make no apologies for all the time we've spent with Filisur, because for me, it's sheer nostalgia. finally, the 10:33 Davos shuttle appears, and in the station, the crocodile with its mixed train departs for Kur. There's the Davos shuttle, pulling in behind. It will wait there for a few minutes for the arrival of the local passenger from Kur, due in at 10:40. In just over 1 make-believe hour, we've seen feverish activity, but now things are quietening down, and the morning's busy period ends with the departure of the shuttles to Kur and Davos. There are few railways as picturesque as those in Switzerland, and Filisur captures the scene remarkably well. Barry Kelsall, in common with other models of his caliber, have spent years of research to achieve this standard. Now, Colin Monk and Jeff Drew wanted a small station with lots of water around it, and that's how Port Sandford came into being.
Okay.
Colin and Jeff are members of the North Devon Model Railway Club. In fact, they're practically the only members. Port Sandford is an imaginary old-style harbour. The small village originates from the 17th century, when fishing was the main industrial activity. It forms the terminus of a branch line from the Taunton to Barnstaple line. The layout itself depicts a period in the early 1900s, and the railway is used for the transport of goods to Southern Ireland via the ferry. The almost dilapidated station runs out on a pier, and that is where a lot of the charm of this layout lies. Because there are no turning facilities for tender engines, these little tank engines are the mainstay of the motive power on the layout. The fishing industry is an important user of the railway, and trains load up here and leave daily for the major fish markets. These empty fish vans that came in earlier are now being shunted up into the fish loading platform. And there on the platform, waiting to load up, are the fish porters. And as this would take a little time, there's a chance for the loco to be coaled and watered. Apart from the railway and the unusual pier station, the boats and quayside buildings are also a joy to look at. Those pier supports really do look as though they are continuously lashed by the sea and gales of the Atlantic. The pierhead is supported on 32 wooden legs, solid and sturdy. And that's the local Great Western passenger train, moving off into the countryside to rejoin the Taunton-Barnstaple line, passing the quayside goods depot. As well as the Great Western line, there's also a Southern Railway branch, which connects with Barnstaple Junction. From a quarry on this branch line, a regular movement of china clay traffic takes place down to the harbour. This rather handsome-looking tender locomotive is a Class Q. Its power is essential to work these heavy trains over the steeply graded southern branch. We'll have to watch out here, because over the whole layout there are several dozen seagulls. With a little help from our sound effects department, we can add another dimension to the scene. One of the operating features of the layout is the need to run most arriving freight trains up into the station before they're shunted back into the goods yard or placed on the quayside. This gives the operator plenty to do and the viewer plenty to watch. The buildings which line the quayside are all scratch-built, mainly from 1/8 of an inch thick card. Nearly all are modelled on actual buildings, long since disappeared, which were scattered around various fishing towns and villages in Devon and Cornwall. The large fiddle yard has 9 storage roads, 4 for the Southern Line trains and 5 for the Great Western. And there, out of the fiddle yard, goes the train carrying the Irish mail. As the driver sweeps in at a fast pace, he obviously means to arrive on time. The mail must go through, you know. Ah, but there's no sign of the ferry. Perhaps it's still battling with the Atlantic waves. Never mind. The mail can be unloaded onto the platform, and when the ferry does come in, taken down this rather well-modelled covered gangway. Meanwhile, the now empty mail vans are shunted out into the goods yard to make way for the arrival of a local passenger train of the Southern Line. And here she comes, down the gradient into the approaches of the station. As a feature on a layout, water is something which modellers often find hard to portray. We see small ponds and pools, but seldom a large expanse. So, is it difficult? Well, Jeff Drew admits that getting it to look right on Port Sandford was more by luck than by judgment. The water area is quite large, and the answer was a thick coating of textured sealing emulsion, pulled into the shape of waves with a paintbrush. Add colours, and hey presto, a choppy sea.
Port Sandford may not be everyone's cup of tea in the authentic model railway world, but it's a fine example of imaginative modelling. It's a sort of modelling I personally find really very exciting. Well, another Lineside look in the can. I hope this programme has given you some encouragement and some new ideas for your own models. As for me, I'll be going round the exhibitions as usual, and if you see me, don't hesitate to say hello. Meanwhile, bye-bye for now.